To the Kennan Institute. My name is Will Pomerantz. I'm Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute, and just a brief note about some upcoming events, all of which are on our homepage and all of which are open to the public. This coming Friday, June 27th from 9 to 10:30, we will have a book talk from Mark Schrod, who's an Assistant Professor of Political Science at Villanova University. And he will be talking about his new book, Vodka Politics, Alcohol, Autocracy, and the Secret History of the Russian State. Next Tuesday, July 1st, we'll have a panel discussion here from 10:30 to 12 a.m. on Russia, Ukraine, and energy security. It will be led by the Wilson Center's Jan Kalitsky, and will include John Byerly, William Courtney, former ambassadors to Russia and Kazakhstan, respectively, and Julia Nene, Senior Director, Russian Eurasia. Today, it is our great pleasure to have Lucia Seybert here with us. Dr. Seybert is currently a Title VIII supported research scholar at the Kennan Institute, studying nuclear energy regulation in the post-Soviet space. She is also a lecturer at American University School of International Service. She received her PhD from Cornell University in 2012 and an MA from Georgetown University. Today she is going to be speaking about energy insecurity and the luxury of sovereignty along Russia's pipelines.
Thank you, Will.
The floor is yours.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today, my talk, and this is linked to a sort of a bigger project, will address an important theoretical question, but also one that has some very compelling practical applications. Specifically, I'm going to ask what sovereignty means to states and whether or not it means the same thing, and how states essentially value their sovereignty in energy terms, because energy security has become such a crucial topic to when considering state survival, not just in Eastern Europe. I'm essentially going to ask the question whether countries can remain sovereign in the absence of energy security. In order to answer this question, as you know, most decent research questions, it depends, and it depends on the definition of sovereignty and energy security. Traditionally, sovereignty has been defined through sort of territorial positioning of the argument. Territory has been very closely over the course of history linked to what we understand as a sovereign state. However, there are more layers to this, and of course, in light of the recent events in Crimea, we may be tempted to again associate sovereignty with territory, but it's not just that, and that's a big part of what I'm going to be talking about today. A big part of sovereignty is also autonomy, and that's associated with a territorial understanding of states. But the question is whether states can make their decisions autonomously. And over the past few decades, it's been increasingly more obvious that states are not really as autonomous as they would like themselves to be, or as they believe themselves to be. And this is in the absence of any kind of tension or intrusion from your disproportionately large neighbor. Just the process of globalization and the flows that enter and exit a state's territory. States don't necessarily make all these decisions, policy decisions, autonomously, and then it affects how legitimate the governments that run these states are. But legitimacy is an important component of sovereignty as well. And then autonomy in decision-making is also linked to control over outcomes, right? And these additional facets of sovereignty have been layered on top of territory over the years of research that have followed, the Peace of Westphalia that really established the principle of sovereignty in international relations. I will argue that there's actually been a trend towards abandoning territory and not only treating the subsequent components of sovereignty as prior to that, but also that there is a degree of openness among states to balance those, to basically not take it all as one simple package that amounts to sovereignty. Now, about energy security, I define it as an uninterrupted physical availability of energy products on a market in any given country. The price should be affordable to all consumers. And then there's a component to energy security that concerns the well-being of citizens and the functioning of the economy. But that's all, there's only a very small step towards political stability from functioning economy and well-being of citizens. I've actually adopted this definition from some European Commission documents. And since it's an EU definition, it also has to include respect for the environment and sustainable development. But that's not necessarily always part of energy security in all states' calculations. Now, do states have any room to maneuver in preserving their sovereignty in light of the energy security pressures that they face recently? And as I've already suggested, there is some room for sovereignty bargains. And what do I mean by that? Sovereignty bargains essentially erase the all or nothing approach in defining statehood. A state in Eastern Europe can conceivably abandon some of its autonomy if that means that the legitimacy of that policy decision will be increased and that control over outcomes will likely increase. And that has been, in fact, the explanation for why states in Eastern Europe have jumped so eagerly into EU membership, right, where they actually lost some autonomy in decision making. However, this was based on their identity preferences deemed legitimate and hopefully increase their control in a lot of policy areas. Now, energy policy is actually kind of unique that way because it's one of the closest to home, right? The one that is the hardest to abandon, along with actually cultural policy for European member states. And so that's why I've selected energy to study the meaning of sovereignty here. And so states focus on the meaningfulness of sovereignty rather than how autonomous their decisions may be. And this is merely reflecting the understanding that, well, the international environment is already very fluid, right? The states don't have a lot of autonomy in making their decisions. If it's not Brussels constraining their decisions, it's Moscow, right? And so it's a trade-off. And so at least by choosing something that's in line with their legitimacy, with their identity, that decision can be deemed legitimate. So that's the most simple way to explain what a sovereignty bargain means. And hopefully it'll become more clear as I go on. So what makes states more open to such bargains? That is really the research question that I'm asking in this project. Because some states, we would think that, well, if this is a possibility, right, where you have this novel approach to sovereignty and it takes away a lot of the concerns with how autonomously you make your decisions and so on, why wouldn't all states want to do that, right? And I argue that it's actually an interaction of two variables, the type of threat that states face and the alignment options that are available to them. Now, the type of threat concerns the particular dyad that is linked to the energy supply, right? So there is the supplier and the customer. So in this case, it would be Russia and some Eastern European country. And we see Russia as potentially threatening the sovereignty of various Eastern European states, right? But I'm arguing that we actually have to look beyond just that threat dimension. We actually have to look at, well, so what routes for escape do states really even have, right? Because some have more options than others. And we have to incorporate that into our analytical models if we want to have a compelling account of what's happening on the ground in Eastern Europe. So let's take them one by one. Type of threat. It varies depending on the structural constraints, right? So literally the physical realities of who has resources and who doesn't, right? And what the means of getting the resources from one place to another might be. But there's also a political component to this, because states can be dependent on one another, but if the political relations are friendly, well, then the structural asymmetry is not quite so problematic, right? I'm incorporating both these factors into my definition of threat, and from that we can derive either the direct threat category or an indirect threat, right? So if you're both really dependent and you're not friends with the person you're really dependent on, then you're going to consider anything they do a direct threat to you. And again, this will become more tangible when I actually speak about the cases. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So there are two, and I say 2+ options with regard to sovereignty. When it comes to threat as a determinant of how states think about sovereignty. So first, they can either give it up in exchange for secure energy supplies, right? And so the sovereignty will be just kind of formal, but not true. They will not be truly independent in how they make their decisions, don't have much control over their outcomes, and the legitimacy, it might be limping and or absent, right? And here, just to give you something to hold on to, here I'm thinking maybe Belarus, right? On the opposite side of the spectrum, states can resist threats at all cost, right? And then they can either win that battle, but given that we're talking about very asymmetric relationships, it's unlikely, and resistance can be very, very costly, right? And this is the range of options we have, right? If we're only looking at threat, you either give in to the threat or you resist the threat, right? But it's not always between a rock and a hard place. It can also be between a rock and a pillow, maybe, right? And so the additional dimension that I'm introducing here kind of captures the concept of a pillow there, and that's states can give up some of their sovereignty, and then they are able to collect it in a magnified form later, right? So EU member states have given up some of their sovereignty, or Europeanists like to say that that it's a shared sovereignty model, and they then benefit from the unified decision making in European Union. Now, I will also note that this is still to happen with regard to energy, right? But in other issue areas, Europe has advanced far along on this scale. So here, if we look at this, the second dimension there, I mean, the in-between step, right? The gray area, that's when we have to introduce the second variable that I'm proposing, right? So it's the interaction of the type of threat with the alignment options available to a country. So what do I mean by that? That identity-based alignment flexibility refers to the desire for membership in a well-defined society of states, right? But there's a second component to that. The country actually has to be welcome in that society of states, right? Because if we're talking about options, right? It's like, oh, well, I'm going to go hide in my friend's house. Well, if my friend's not going to open the door, I'm not going to be able to hide at my friend's house, right? So that's the flexibility that I'm talking about. And again, the type of threat concerns the dyad that is involved in the energy relationship, right? But these kinds of tensions don't happen in a vacuum, and we have to consider what the options available to these countries are. And that's why we have to introduce the relations with the other countries, and most prominently the European Union as a community of states. So that's what this variable captures. The mechanism here is about the validation of the risk. So it's risky. It's risky to suddenly say, well, I don't care about the traditional notion of sovereignty when everyone else does. That's very difficult to do. So there is a little bit of a dependence on what others do in this particular situation as well. And by having these options, the alignment flexibility, countries actually validate the risk through effective collective decision making, and even though the autonomy may be reduced, their control over policy outcomes is enhanced, and ideally legitimacy is also increased. So depending on presence or absence of such options, countries can either, choose to do that, or if their options are not really there, then they will just stick to traditional definitions of sovereignty. Right? So here's a little 2x2 that shows the interaction of the two variables. Right? So you have alignment flexibility and then the type of threat. Right? And so in this case, the threat is direct. So it's very salient to countries that either are vulnerable in terms of territory and the supply of energy. And also there's political tensions, right? Because we have, high levels of threat. But there, the bottom mini paragraph here concerns the alignment flexibility, right? So there's limited options because either a country wants to join a community and is not welcome or not expressly welcome, or it doesn't even want to, right? And so an example of a country that would like to maybe move out of this this cell and have high options of alignment would be Ukraine, right? And we'll get to that. So then, down here, it's kind of the flip side, right? So you're still physically dependent, or, it's indirect threat, right? So the physical dependence is low, or you're friends with the person you're dependent on, right? And you give up some sovereignty, but it's by consent, at least officially. And then there's very little identity connections to other countries. That's what I'm thinking, Belarus. And here we have a direct threat, right, but also high alignment options. Now, Ukraine would like to be here, but it's not exactly a red carpet to Brussels right now, right? Even though they're signing the association agreement, but then, Turkey signed theirs in the 60s, so. But then, if there is a path for being welcome at your friend's house, who's going to kind of help you weather the storms of the unfriendly neighbor, then that's a good option, even though the threat is direct. And then here I'm thinking Lithuania. And then there's also, to complete the cells, there's countries who are not really dependent, or there's very little political interaction, and then there's little incentive to even really consider or think about territory. It's kind of like, you don't really think about money until you don't have it, right? And so these countries kind of always have the money in terms of sovereignty, and so they don't think about not having it. And they also have the identity alignment that fits that. And here I'm thinking the Czech Republic, okay? So a little preview of our cases. Just to look at some numbers in terms of, I should probably move this, right? Can you guys hear me when I look that way? Or maybe I should look at that one. So we have the level of dependence on Russian gas imports for a list of countries. And here we have Belarus and Lithuania and Ukraine and the Czech Republic. And they are all very highly dependent on Russia. This is what happened in the 2009 gas crisis, right? And so Belarus and Lithuanian supplies were not affected. Ukraine obviously lost all its access to gas, and then the Czech Republic lost 71% of the gas that it gets, right? So this is a pretty precarious situation, right? Again, here, this is numbers more recently, 2013 or 14. Still very dependent on gas, crude oil, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Czech Republic also. An interesting data point is Slovakia. 100% during the 2009 crisis, they actually got a setup to make reverse flows in the pipelines technologically possible in 2010, having learned from the gas crisis. Now it's only 63% dependent on Russia, right? So countries learn, right? They do respond to threats, but and this is an important illustration of what I'm saying, the fact that Slovakia was able to do this was a function of the solidarity within the European Union, right? So that is evidence of their alignment flexibility. And I don't have Slovakia in the framework, but it illustrates that dynamic well. So here you see that, the Czech Republic is still very dependent on natural gas, on Russian natural gas, but then when you look at actually how much of their economy is natural gas, it's only 15%, right? So that also affects the vulnerability that countries face. All these numbers are really supposed to illustrate that the Eastern European countries are not overreacting, right? The threat is real, and they may or may not have these alignment options that I'm talking about. So here again, summary of the countries, right? So direct threat, low alignment flexibility for Ukraine, friendly relations with Russia make it indirect threat for Belarus, and they don't really want to go in the EU, and Lithuania and the Czech Republic being on the EU alignment side of things. Okay. So let's take these countries one by one. Ukraine. Threat is direct because, we all know. And there's, the other component is alignment flexibility, and that's low for Ukraine. We have two components to threat, which is vulnerability and politics, right? So we have very high dependence on Russian gas, Russian oil. Ukraine is extremely energy inefficient, which I've heard accounts that's actually by choice of select groups within Ukraine. It's certainly a strategy. And so here we see that, it's not a very evenly split pie chart of that's the energy mix for Ukraine, right? We have natural gas is, a big part, half of it almost, and a good third is coal, and then we have crude oil right there. So politics. Repeated periods of tension with Russia, right? This most recent one is just another episode in the same relationship. Gas supply has been shut off periodically by Gazprom. And they would like to have options, but they don't have them, right? The country is internally divided about direction of the country. So it's not obvious that all Ukrainians even want to go in the European Union, right? And the European Union is not exactly, is lukewarm at best, right? And then there's a strong opposition to any such behavior from Moscow. So what does this mean for sovereignty strategies, right? So these are my kind of input variables, right? So what do we put into the equation? This is the outcome, right? What are we looking, this is in political science terms, the dependent variable. What are we studying here? And the sovereignty strategies that Ukraine has, basically been forced to adopt was, there's limited legitimacy gains because there's not a clear identity about which way the country should go. Autonomy is low, and control over outcomes is low, right? So Ukraine would prefer a disaggregated sovereignty approach, sort of sovereignty bargains, but it's pulled into a focus on territory. It's hard to ignore territory when part of it is invaded by another country, right? And also, its advances to join the European Union have been rejected, right, for various reasons. Now, Lithuania is in a slightly better position because it still faces direct threat from Russia, especially after it was forced to shut down its nuclear power plant and now depends on all power generation using gas, and all that gas comes from Russia. Right? So there's the energy mix. I'm not going to go over this line by line to save time, but we can come back to the figures after the presentation if you'd like. The politics is also far from friendly, and this has actually become more problematic over the past decade or so. Essentially, the stronger Russia has become, the more worried Lithuania has become. So they've come to regret their decision to abandon their nuclear reactor at EU's request, because that has made them highly dependent on Russia. Now, when they agreed to do that, it was far from the threat that it is now. But their alignment flexibility is high. So that's their pillow, right? So between a rock and a pillow. I mean, rock is still hard on one side, but the pillow makes that a little better. And so it's an EU member, and it its energy connections point eastward, but its commitment to the EU is very strong, right? So the identity component of that flexibility is very strong there. And actually, we should have mentioned here that it's actually an energy island with respect to EU grids. Like there is no other way to get electricity to Lithuania, right? Estonia and I believe Latvia as well have connections to, or are working on connections to Scandinavia at least, and there are some plans to do that in Lithuania as well, but Poland is dragging their feet on connecting through south, and so it's a big challenge for Lithuania. Okay, so sovereignty strategies. Lithuania has made a decisive turn towards the EU, right? It has given up some of its autonomy in exchange for more legitimacy, and it's a wager on control, right? So when I say there's a rock and a pillow, the pillow is there, but it really depends on what other European Union members will do, right? The softness of the pillow comes from the greater impact that European countries will have as a group in negotiating with Russia as a supplier, right, of energy. But as we know, they can't even agree on domestic internal energy policy, and the foreign policy component is even more problematic. There's talk about this. They do try to do that. However, each country of significance, Germany and others, still have bilateral relations with Russia, right? And that undermines some of those efforts, or the credibility of the commitment to that principle of solidarity that Lithuania is banking on. Right? So right now, presenting that as a desirable strategy, but it really depends on what others will do. The direct threats from Russia forced it to abandon the full control and territory-focused notion of autonomy, and there's power in EU solidarity, but we have to see what happens. Okay, the Czech Republic. Czech Republic does not like being in the group with other Eastern European countries. They're kind of funny about that, but hey, my presentation makes sense theoretically. So a threat is indirect in the Czech Republic. It has low vulnerability. It still depends on 75% of its gas imports on Russia, but you can bring it in via 2 pipelines, right? So if there's no gas flowing through Ukraine or Slovakia, you can do it through the northern routes through Poland, and 65% Russian oil. But if you look at their pie chart, it's nicely split, right? And actually, most of the biggest chunk is provided by domestic coal. And this is not ideal for emissions, which might be one reason why they are so reluctant about the common EU energy policy, which has very ambitious emissions targets. But it makes them relatively secure, especially in light of the average in the Eastern European neighborhood. Politics, they're very, very, very pragmatic. The Czech Republic is very pragmatic in terms of EU politics in general, and it does apply to energy policy as well. They focus on strategic partnerships that include Russia and kind of follow the German template here, right? So, they are committed to EU, but they are very instrumental about how to approach the benefits of EU membership. So what does this do for their sovereignty strategies? They acknowledge the option of ceding autonomy, right? So option of ceding autonomy here would mean making common EU energy policy more forceful, right? And so they'll say they want to do that. When they held the EU presidency, it was actually during the 2009 gas crisis with Ukraine. Actually not insignificant. So they give lip service to that, but they're very cautious about the common EU energy policy, right? And they give up limited sovereignty, but only when it's likely to meet with adequate payoff, right? And in energy, again, it has not been the case so far. So then moving on to Belarus, we have indirect threat, and you may say, well, they're not any more secure than Lithuania, right? But they toe the line a lot better than Lithuania as far as Moscow is concerned, right? So even though they're still severely dependent, and this pie chart looks the worst, right? It's more like, I don't know, it's just slices. I don't know. The political pressure is very low, right? Russia is viewed as a strategic partner. It's a transit country, but Beltransgaz is 50% owned by Gazprom, and there is some rhetoric of diversification, but no one actually does anything about it, right? And there's very little ambition to claim any kind of westward identity, at least for now. So in terms of sovereignty strategies, sovereignty is compromised by economic and political dependence, but everyone's okay with that, right, in Belarus. So here's a little summary of what we're looking at. We have Ukraine, still traditional notion of sovereignty, but because they have to, right? The threat's direct and no one else is offering anything else. Lithuania, still direct threat, but a good option there. Belarus, just kind of no reason to reconsider sovereignty, and also very, very little desire to. And the Czech Republic, that's actually, one of what's the interesting cases here is that they could, right? They do have the luxury of changing the understanding of sovereignty to the various components of it, as opposed to just the all or nothing approach of traditional definitions. But they don't have any need to do that. And because it is somewhat risky, as I've explained with the example of Lithuania, they don't do that. So what this means is that, direct threat is not a death sentence, right? You can still escape that if you have alignment flexibility. So that's what this line shows us. What this column shows us is that, well, okay, so you have this wonderful option, you have alignment flexibility, you can think about sovereignty in novel terms that actually enhances your standing with other states in the long run. But guess what? Unless you're pressured to do that, you're not actually even going to take up that option, right? And that's the Czech Republic. Okay, so what does this mean for how states think about sovereignty and energy security, and what can we take away from this? First, energy highlights the survival aspect of sovereignty. We can all agree to that. It's the least likely issue area for states to adopt a new perspective, so it's actually somewhat significant that Lithuania has been able to do that. And there are some other examples in the EU. Slovakia is the one I mentioned. But it is risky, but it still shows us that we cannot just focus on threats, right? If we focus just on threats, it has the potential to escalate tensions when they should not or need not escalate, right? So if we think about energy security as not just a confrontation, but as an opportunity for developing partnerships, everyone says, well, let's just be partners with Russia. Let's just all play nice, right? But that's not going to happen. But if there's other options surrounding that relationship with Russia, for whatever country we're talking about, then that may shift the expectations of both the Russian side and the country concerned. So we have to look outside the threat dyad there. And we do this by looking at identity-based options. And that's why I've introduced the concept of thinking about sovereignty as having the luxury of thinking about sovereignty in different terms. And then the identity interacts with threats there. Importantly, however, as the Czech Republic has showed us, states may do that, but will not always do that. Right? And again, this affects how we understand crises and what the appropriate policy responses to crises may be. Right? And we can again take the lesson of Slovakia, who in 2009 did not jump on the opposition wagon with Russia, to much displeasure of some of Slovakia's citizens, actually. There was a lot of animosity towards Russia, but the kind of pragmaticism concerns not only economic relations, but also being open to other options, right? That may or may not be there. Ukraine's never going to create those options, but seizing them when they are there. And the reverse flows and the increased security effectively in Slovakia illustrates that point very well. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for your presentation. I think I want to begin with, you've talked about threats and the luxury of having some flexibility and so forth, but I'm curious in terms of your argument. Does the argument then, to a certain extent, boil down to the fact that Russia really is in control over the sovereignty of these regions? That, there's some flexibility in terms of how individual nations fight back or how the EU fights back. And for the EU, I'm specifically thinking of the Third Energy Charter and other things that they've done. But essentially, are you arguing that the notion that there's a codependency kind of between the EU and Russia, that Russia is dependent on the hard currency hard currency earnings from the EU, and that impacts its sovereignty? Is that really less of an option? Because based on what you've said, essentially, that's Russia and its ability to control energy that really is the driver in terms of sovereignty in Europe. So does your argument kind of place more doubts into this notion of codependency and place Russia really in a superior position in terms of how it deals with sovereignty in Europe?
Yes. In the short run, yes. But, and I should have said this, the identity component of my argument actually extends time horizons to some extent, right? And so what countries are willing to give up now, they might collect down farther down the line. But you raise an important point about dependency and how it goes both ways. And so we could take my argument and turn it around and say, well, so what are Russia's identity alignment options, right? And right now, they're scrambling to, kind of be considered not just the pariah there's been some efforts, and President Putin is playing both ways. He has domestic audiences and international ones. But whatever is targeted at the international ones actually reveals that there is some concern with Russia's reputation, right? And that is some of that, identity. What kind of a state do you consider yourself to be? Right? And so we could turn that around and say, well, Russia is limiting its alignment options by its own actions, right? And so my argument does not necessarily comment on specific outcomes. It's tempting, and I want to do that, but it more suggests that we have to understand these energy security relationships in more rich terms than just a question of threat. Right? And yes, and a lot of times it will end up being structurally determined. This is the reality. I can't move the Siberian gas and put it in Germany, right? Unless I get a pipeline. But that's the physical reality of it all. But it's very important to consider how states respond to that political reality. But it's a very good question. Yeah.
Right here. We're bringing a microphone.
My name's Thomas Grindley. There appear to be some occurrences in Russia which would seem to alleviate possible threats to sovereignty, such as the involvement of multinationals such as ExxonMobil and BP, and also the employment of such people as former German Chancellor Schröder by Gazprom. Could you comment on that and possibly give some examples about the involvement of multinationals in Russia?
That's a very good question because, I'm talking about sovereignty, I'm talking about states, and I act like this is all that there's to it, that it's just, governments talking about this. But actually, most of the energy deals happen between companies and governments, right? And that's why it's a very important question. However, I think it fits in my framework in that it affects the calculus of the likelihood of those, the identity-based payoffs, right? So what you're saying, you say that that's actually a good thing, that, although I'm not sure whose sovereignty you refer to being threatened or preserved by.
I would be thinking that Russia tends to be possibly threatening the sovereignty of all its neighbors.
Oh, so you're talking about the general ambition of Russia, right, and how that's curbed by the presence of multinationals there. Right. So yeah, it's going to essentially make Russia less threatening in the long run, right? If we allow the companies to operate there, right? They will put a check on Russia's ambition. And is that the question? No? Am I misunderstanding?
Generally speaking, that is the question.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll take the question as given.
Yeah. Yes, that's an important part that the private sector, right, plays an important role there. But that's actually why it's difficult to just talk about the threat to the Ukrainian sovereignty, right? Because we have to be we can consider the pragmatic impact, right, of that threat. And everyone is kind of cringing in the business circles, right, about what's going on in Ukraine, because it's a little too political and too dramatic and too uncertain, and business doesn't like that, right? So yes, that is a little bit of a break. But if that kind of ambition takes over, it's hard for that to always play out. I mean, we've had, nationalizations of property have happened in the past. With regard to former Chancellor Schroeder working for Gazprom, that's he's always been an advocate of the bilateral partnership with Russia, between Germany and Russia, and that is kind of what the Czech Republic is trying to do, right? So all that, it can be slotted in this kind of framework without too much effort. I'm not trying to say that this is not happening. I'm just providing a little more accurate theoretical explanation. But those are all important considerations that I can probably work in there to illustrate some of the dynamics. So thank you.
Right here.
Ed Berger. I'm impressed by some of the observations made by Thane Gustafson in this city, who's a scholar of Russian oil and gas sectors and the political implications of those resources. And his observation is that there is, in fact, a forthcoming limitation on those resources in Russia, to the extent that it will have substantial effects on the political maneuvering and outcomes in that part of the world. What do you think about that?
So what specific limitations? I mean, I can just go with the ones I know.
Well, his observation is that the Russia inherited the Soviet gas and oil supply resources of the country. One has to dig more deeply now to get them out, much more expensively, and one needs foreign technological assistance to do that. Mm-hmm. And there's now some competition from the rest of the world, including the United States, for gas, for example. Mm-hmm. That suggests a change in the calculus for Russia as a threat, for example.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, I agree with that. And I would actually add to that even even if the reserves were constant, right? There is major investment in infrastructure that is necessary, right, to even keep them flowing. And I mean, think about, there's a huge pipeline like this going all the way across Russia. I mean, DC has trouble maintaining its roads, right? So if you think about that kind of, there's all kinds of risks. Russia is, I don't think Russia is oblivious to that, right? Which might actually explain something about the timing of what's going on here, right? But the kind of comment that I would choose to make about this would be that it only compounds the need that the EU and outside the EU, European countries have to reconsider their dependence on Russian gas, right? And the shale discoveries it's a long-term kind of factor to consider. It's not immediate, and especially not in Europe. But then we're not escaping anything there, right? It's the fossil fuel dependence, and that's really the linchpin here, right? That's what all this hinges on is, well, if we didn't have this dependence, we wouldn't even be talking about the threat to sovereignty from energy security. And the main point that I'm trying to communicate here is that the one way to become impervious to aggression is to stop caring about the things that it targets, right? So if we stop caring about fossil fuels, right, the aggression concerning energy security will be kind of a moot point, right? And we all know that. But how do we get there? Well, through cooperation, and cooperation has to happen outside of just the threat environment. And we have to look for ways that states can cooperate and think about solidarity means to resolve this. And it's not just reverse flows and pipelines, but research and development and so on. So I took that a little bit farther away from your question, but I acknowledge your point, and I think Russia is aware of that, and European countries are aware of that. It's very hard to escape that, especially given Russian the contracts with Gazprom, and we have yet to see what's going to happen.
Question right here then. We'll get a microphone to you right now.
Hi, my name is Mariam Darasashvili. I represent U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting. And my question, I understand that this is not in the scope of your research, but I was wondering, have you ever studied the region of South Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey? Those countries try to build an alternative energy routes and energy supplies that would work for Europe. But of course, Russia opposes this and uses all of its leverages to stop it. But if these countries would, continue resisting the threats and keep building their energy security and energy routes, what could be the interest? How strong could be the interest of Europe in supporting these countries and in having these alternative energy routes? Is it that important for Europe?
Right. That's a very good question, and you are right. I'm not there yet. Okay, so I'm glad that you asked. So I'm going to improvise here a little. We can think about what it would do. So say a country that has Turkey, Azerbaijan. You have right now they're facing. They're somewhere in between, right? So depending on what their politics. It's again case-by-case basis, right? Depending on their politics, they're closer to Belarus or closer to Ukraine, right? There's not a lot of alignment options because you're saying, well, would there be any interest? Because you got that point exactly, right? It has to be also reciprocated by, and one of the reasons that it's not reciprocated by the European Union is because the European is a little worried about provoking Russia, right? And that provocation hinges on the levels of threats there, right? So it's direct interaction of the threats and the identities there. And so if they were able to exploit their own resources and connect them to European markets, and there are plans to do that, although most recently now Gazprom wants to build its own pipeline under the Black Sea, so South Stream is a little threatened, but that would put them more here, right, in direct, but not in a way that Russia would like, right? It would not be the compliant Belarus. It would be almost like the Czech Republic, well, they don't need Russia anymore, right? And there's an important if there, is Russia going to let them even get that far, right? So, but it's interesting to think about other cases within this framework, right? Because it's helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right back here.
I am Charlie Passanante from an international investor, and last week I attended a talk actually here by a man named Martin Sarnov, and he was talking about Bulgarian energy security, and he briefly mentioned the idea of a sort of European energy union in just some kind of forum for Eastern European nations to kind of consolidate and give them increased leverage against Russia for these energy concerns. And I didn't know if that is a realistic idea or if you had any thoughts on that matter.
There's ideal options and there's realistic options, right? And we're talking about now we're getting into EU politics, and I could go on, but I guess I will give you a few responses that are kind of quick. One is the European Union is a big block of countries that are very diverse, and it's hard for them to agree on much because there are so many, and especially with energy security, their needs are very diverse, and that's both a strength but also a difficulty when you're trying to arrive at decisions, right? And they do have veto power with regard to important matters like that. That said, we do have the euro, right, which was equally unlikely when it first got started. I don't necessarily think that the Eastern European countries are going to be successful in doing this on their own without the Western European countries. And it goes back to the question about what Chancellor Schroeder's doing and what Germany's policies might be. And Poland was not happy when the North Sea pipeline was bypassing it, right? And there's other history there too, but in order to be successful, it will have to happen as a partnership, and I'm speaking very hypothetically here. It will have to happen as a partnership between the Eastern Europeans and the Western Europeans, because just of the underlying asymmetries, right? When you think about the need is in the East most immediately, and the resources and bargaining leverage is in the West. That's why Lithuania was so eager to do this, right? They had a lot to gain from this. But again, what they do depends on what everyone else does. And I mean everyone else, not just Germany and not just Bulgaria. But it's nice to think about those things, right? It would be... Now, the more important one to talk about here actually would be the Eurasian Union, right? And the attempt at integration on the Russian side of things. And how that's going to succeed, whether that's going to succeed. But that's a different question.
To follow up, though, on that question and the issue about Bulgaria, because obviously the EU has basically told Bulgaria that it can't build South Stream through Bulgaria. So to what extent, as we talk about sovereignty and the importance of sovereignty, is the EU beginning to move? It gets back to the question of the political point that you raised, that in response to Russia, the EU now has decided that it's going to directly limit
Right.
national sovereignty, and that's how the issue is going to be resolved, that it eventually a EU response will be mandated,
Right.
not only in terms of the third energy sector and the requirements to kind of divide Gazprom from distributor and
Right.
producer, but also essentially telling countries like Bulgaria that they can't build the pipeline.
Right. That's an excellent question, actually, because you can think about Bulgaria would have started out where Lithuania is, right, in the framework, and they joined the European Union to get some kind of control over policy outcomes, and there was underlying legitimacy because it was desirable to be in the European Union. Now, if the European Union starts doing these kinds of things, most Eastern Europeans will get flashbacks to Moscow, and they're going to get very kind of not happy about that, or very, very defensive, to put it mildly. But again, to stick to the framework, what that would undermine would be the legitimacy of that, the sovereignty component, right? So there would no longer be the legitimacy of the already costly decision, because it's a costly decision, especially in regard to all the reforms that these countries have had to undergo, to join the European Union, right? And so I wonder if then Bulgaria would want to abandon that. My guess is the EU would compensate it to them in other ways, right? Just how it works. But again, because of the legitimacy concern.
Right. Any last question back here?
Hi. Hi, Lucia. I really enjoyed your presentation. Very interesting.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask your opinion about the recent disruption of supply of Russian gas to Ukraine, and what do you think about this ongoing arbitration? Russia initiated a litigation against Ukraine. Gazprom and Naftogaz initiated also initiated litigation because of its disagreement with the current contractual arrangements of this signed contract, intergovernment of this Gazprom Naftogaz agreement in 2009. So, do you think it will? What impact it will have on energy security in Europe? Because at Stockholm Chamber of Commerce, it takes a lot of time to consider the case, and what will be the outcome?
I wish I knew. I mean, I think we all wish we knew. I can say that Russia is, none of this is new, and this is not a novel situation for anyone, and it's more like a iterated negotiation game,
But
right?
it's negotiations are over, so
Well,
now this.
no. I mean, yes and no, right? I mean, Günther Oettinger is just talking, the European Commissioner for Energy is talking about reconvening, so, we're not done talking as long as the
So
gas
what will
is
be
not.
the implications if now it's at contractual level and they're trying to move it to intergovernmental, but it's purely a contractual disagreement between Naftogaz and Gazprom?
I'm not an international law expert, I
No,
can't
just in
comment.
your opinion, will there be political means to solve this issue? And how long will it take?
I would say that it's been escalated enough to where there is an incentive on both sides to wind things down a little bit. I'll say that. Again, Russia has to be mindful of its reputation. It's running the risk that if this happens often enough, Europe really will, clamp down and find other suppliers, and then that will affect the investments in Russia, right? They may keep making them, and they will be, not as with as much payoff as they would have before, right? So there's a major risk for Russia here in the long run, right? If LNG and shale gas replace the supplies, right? And Ukraine just has other incentives to de-escalate. Mostly it's internal, just order, right? So I do see this as hopefully calming down a little bit, but again, it's just my opinion, and I don't see into these negotiation rooms. I don't know what they're talking about, and I haven't read the contract, but it's an important question to consider, and what I try to do with this talk is to shed some light on beyond just that confrontation that you're alluding to. It's not just about the confrontation, and I'm not gonna go into European energy security because there's a
The-
in the gas price formula. So they concluded this highly non-beneficial agreement for Ukraine, and now they're trying to reconsider. They don't agree on the provisions and that's
right. So beneficial, not beneficial. You agreed to it. You signed it. It's a difficult situation, and whenever you have someone subsidizing your energy who is not your very good friend, this kind of thing is bound to happen.
Okay, I think we're going to bring are there any other last questions? Okay, well, I think we'll bring the conversation to a close then. Contracts are always hard to find, especially in this part of the world, so it's always unclear as to what are the actual terms of the agreement. But thank you so much, Lucia, for your very interesting presentation. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at future.
Thank you all.